Yeah, like it's one of those things where when I saw you talk, the energy that you brought was awesome. And I think that's, such a good place to kind of jump in. I don't want to speak too much for you, but, first and foremost, Dr. Mark Tarmann, I want to welcome you to Quoted. Really am excited to kind of dive into all the things you're working on. So first and foremost, welcome.
Pat, thanks for having me.
Dude, just, like I said, I've taken a look at some of the things you've written, saw you do a live talk this past weekend. But walk me through your background. I know you've got a PhD, and I really want to dive into the millennial side of things, the comic books, but just give us a little background. Tell us a little bit about you if you don't mind.
Sure. So I was originally born in California. As you now see, I'm in New Jersey. So cross-country implant. In the utopia of all the California splendor, born in San Jose, spent time in Southern California, Orange County before I blew up on sitcoms. And I was in Monterey for a bit for high school, and then Davis for my bachelor's degree at the University of California, Davis. Dabbled in pretty much anything you can think of, from slinging ice cream to working as a bouncer at a bar to tax law, of all things. And then with the cross-country venture, that landed me into banking once again, and then eventually insurance, that I have not left since.
A big part of that is a PhD, and I think you had a unique dissertation, if I read it correctly, right? You focused in on millennials, and stop me if I'm wrong here, but...
Now, on the right track. So I have looked at succession planning for small to medium enterprises, specifically looking at millennial development. The industry itself right now is so hyper-focused on attracting millennials, knowing that they're going to be the largest part of the workforce coming up. No one was really looking at the tail end. What do we do after we have them? And so it was a perfect niche opportunity for me to do something non-insurance related that I could look at for 5 years while I'm working on a dissertation, because that's the ultimate goal. When you work on something of that magnitude, even though insurance is ingrained in second nature, do you really want to do that doing your day job and at night while you're doing your studies? So it was a compromise that I came up with, and being a millennial myself, it was a perfect avenue to self-exploration.
That's a perfect little background piece, because that's where I talk so much on Twitter, and I know we started connecting, and you'll see it. I get pretty, there's a lot of volume. Let's just put it that way. I like to tweet. I like to talk, and there's so much conversation about the different generations. And, I've gone so far as to kind of identify as the Oregon Trail generation, just because it was like perfectly cool. Like it's perfect.
I remember those old Macs. My mother was a teacher. Part of the reason why I'm so in love with teaching. But yeah, I remember sitting in her classroom, the square Macs, plugging away, hoping that I didn't starve to death. Good old Oregon Trail.
Exactly. I want to be the banker because I would have enough money, but then we'll see how that all goes. All this conversation, it's always people, I think, say, well, this is my assumptions or this is my experiences. And I think what people at least are starting to recognize with me is I just kind of go to the source. Let's figure it out. So I've got a millennial with a PhD. Let's talk about that. Where are we missing and where are we on target with, whether it's the insurance industry or just the, recruiters in general? What are the things they're hitting on and really doing well when it comes to attracting and retaining millennials? What are the things they need to stay away from?
So the most surprising part of the study was that most business owners are cognizant that there's an issue. Like, I know I have these millennial employees. I know that I need to attract them. I know that they're leaving within 2 years of employment. I just, one, don't know what to do. Two, don't have the resources to keep them because in competition with bigger organizations. Three, they're like, well, all of this is, Hufflepuff and, there's no validity to it. But the most have the feeling that, yes, we recognize that they're different. So to answer your question, because they're so focused on what's going on now and attracting them, for example, I think it's Procter & Gamble that's thinking about changing soap to use acronyms we see every day on text messages. So LOL, they're gearing things, thinking that is the way to attract these individuals that are highly inclined with technology, abbreviated text, emojis, versus looking at what's the real buy-in. What's the underneath component that's keeping these people where they want to go and fulfilling what they need? The issue with millennials, me included, is that we grew up in a generation where parents hovered. They had, experienced hardships themselves, be it financial, be it personal. So having children during that era, in the explosion of, electronics, there was a couple of things that went on. First, they tried to protect from the inundation of information. I know personally being told, well, you can't watch that show, or it's this time o'clock, you need to stop watching TV, get off the computer, you need to do homework, or some other means. But there was all this hovering and protection that really didn't allow millennials to be inundated with the trials and tribulations that the previous generations went through that helped them gain the experience. And the unfortunate part is now we're getting to a point where they're now the majority of the workforce. They're the adults guiding now this new generation coming up with no really sense of, well, one, can I survive? Can I do what's asked of me and survive it? And two, I've never done this before. How am I supposed to do this? The unfortunate part is most leaders, most organizations are just taking the place of parents. All too commonplace, you hear them say, I have to hold their hand. I have to direct them by the shoulders where to go. If I wasn't here, they couldn't do anything on their own. They're just substituting the hovering that the parents had for them. Not necessarily teaching them anything, just hovering them, pushing them through. The same thing you see in the education system is you're seeing them tolerate this behavior because it's come the norm. Well, my study sort of flips it on head and saying what's happening is that we're straining these millennials inundation of information. As you saw in my talk, I, make a similarity between them and the Flash, that we had this giant explosion of information during their younger years. So now they have immediate access, no longer the shelves of, Encyclopedia Britannica. They can just click, get as much information as once. But with that, made them hungrier for more information. And being that industry was so stagnant on manufacturing, A to B, B to C, C to D, any idea of going straight from A to Z was unheard of, and still is in a sense. But the point being is that they now have all this access to information. We essentially, as leaders, now that we're in that generation, need to find a way to guide the focus without hovering and guiding the focus. Allowing to establish that accountability that makes them experience those trials and tribulations to assume ownership of what's going on. Perfect example, growing up for a pocket knife, I had to barter with my father to get my first pocket knife. It was like, well, you can either give me your allowance or you can do some sort of yard work to, this one thing I wanted. How often today do we see a kid in the store being like, well, I want this or I want that? And parents are so quick to give it, because that's the trade-off is they want to keep the passivity of the child. I do it too. I have a 3-year-old. I can't tell you how many times I bought him a Hot Wheels car because it was the easiest thing at the time. It's just human nature. But the point is that they're compensating, giving all this and allowing them just to scoot by. There's no ownership. So, it's commonplace. You talk to people like, well, they drive a car recklessly because they don't care. They don't own it. Or they've broken the phone because they wanted the next generation of phone, because they had no ownership into it. We're seeing the same thing in industry. You're having them do all these things with not really any accountability buy-in. For example, over the weekend at the conference, it was talked about how these businesses are putting money up front to put these millennials through intensive customer service orientation courses or intensive basic training. Well, on the same hand, they're pumping this money into a group that's loving information, like give me information. What's the buy-in to make them stay? What's to say they don't say, oh, thanks for all the information. Now I'm going to go to your competitor because they want to give me more money. Versus saying, well, we'd love to support what you want to do, your work for life balance, but here's the trade-off. You have to give us X for the expedition of Y. And having that buy-in makes them, feel accountable for one, makes them have more in job embeddedness because now they realize the job itself is saying, we respect you. We understand you have this ability. We're not going to get in your way. You do your part, we'll do our part. And that's what we found with this study is that those organizations that treated essentially millennials of whatever level as entrepreneurs had the greatest success of keeping them.
It's phenomenal. And I did go through, I didn't get through the entire study. It's something I obviously want to dive deeper into.
Only if you want a good nap, because that's a very long paper.
But I think it's important, right? Like we're in an era where we've got fake influencers, fake life coach. At some point, the goal with this was to take not just a direct step and say, oh, you're a millennial, so let's talk to you, right? But to say, look, there's a process that's been looked at. And I think switching gears a little bit, but kind of still on that same path, right? You went through what it takes, some of the mindsets. Let's talk about connecting with millennials. And I think you're doing a great job. Your hat, I think, is an easy way to segue into it, right? But you did allude to talking about the Flash a little bit, but how effective is that to utilize something? Comic books tend to be a little bit ageless, right? I mean, they've been around for so long, but they're still so popular. How is that something that you're seeing a connection point maybe with your generation, and maybe to a leadership generation? Is there a connection there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a little backstory. My first job ever was working in a comic book store. So in order to get my, fix of Spider-Man, the Hulk, Venom, which just came out, I swept floors at a comic book store. That was the trade-off because, child labor laws. The trade-off was I would sweep floors, help keep this small, business running in trade for comics. So they've
Good
always
deal.
been nostalgic. They've always been, near and dear to the heart. But the reality is they're also appealing to any gender, any age. As you said, they're timeless. Who doesn't like a story of, a person who's, be it a nerd, if you want to use that term, someone who's less than ideal in a social importance ranking, all of a sudden being inundated with a superpower to then becoming an idol or iconic being in the world. So for your Spider-Man, it's, Peter Parker, who gets bit by a radioactive spider, who now becomes Spider-Man with great strength. You've got the Hulk, who gets hit with gamma radiation and now is almost, invulnerable to hurt. What personal life stories don't correspond and translate to comic books? Who doesn't want to be the Flash to be able to run cross country or get away or, stop time or go back in time? So, across genders, across age, it's the one consistency that's relative moving forward. Even with millennials, yes, the means by which it's communicated have differed. We've gone from paper to electronic, now to digital formats, and now into movies. You see in the movies currently now it's the visual aspect that's most important rather than the content, from going from the pop bubbles to actual live actors. But the same point is that there's this hero that we follow or group of heroes that we follow to take ourselves away from our current troubles of the day. And for millennials, it's a perfect example, well, particularly the Flash, because everyone can relate to being inundated with all this energy, being this speed that everyone would love to have, especially as students. And I think that was the appeal of being a student itself, is like, who wouldn't want to be able to read a book in a blink of an eye? Who would want to be just
Done and
taking all that information?
exactly. Done and being social.
Yeah. Hit all 1,000 followers in 2.3 seconds with your thumb speed. But that's the example I use for millennials is here we are with a group that predecessors had limited information. It was whatever published was available, what was in your immediate environment available, whatever, pre-generations were available to give you insight of what was going on. So all of a sudden you could AOL with that dial-up, find out, what the weather was across the nation. There was a big push about talking to other worlds. So all of a sudden you have these normal individuals with endless power of expanded communication at a click of a mouse, which has only progressively gotten more and more expansive because now technology is getting faster. We're talking wirelessly versus on a telephone, face-to-face, non-verbally still able to communicate it. Who knows what the future will hold? The same idea is that, so this generation has been given immediate access to this expansive communication, while the previous generation is still acclimated and holding on to previous tradition. They still prefer sticky notes and handwritten correspondence. Things that millennials like, well, that's defeating the purpose of technological advancement. So there's two parts. One, they've been given this power for immediate access. Two, they have to be cognizant that not everyone's at the same speed. So as I said in my talk, I know that I was called out that it wasn't the Flash who said it, that it was Spider-Man. But the reality is millennials and those coming up have been given this boundless energy of information and are now responsible for disseminating it to all people, being the coming generation, being Generation Zeros, or the existing generations being the boomers and Generation X. I think to answer your point, comic books itself is a great bridge in whatever sector or environment which you're communicating to illustrate your point, because everyone has some sort of reference to the comic book or even the movie nowadays.
You mentioned that I wouldn't call it job hopping, but looking for opportunities to create new skill sets, opportunities to, again, the maybe old guard looks at it and says, oh, that's just job hopping. Can you walk us through that a little bit? Because I don't think you look at it as job hopping, right?
Right. So us growing up being on that Oregon Trail side, it used to be if someone showed some of your resume, there was a job for 2 years, another job for 3 years. The first idea or perception they had, you know, this person has no job commitment. They're a flight risk. Why do we want to invest our time with this person? Well, during my doctoral studies, I had an opportunity to do a micro study with younger millennials to just get their idea of why the statistic of them leaving every 2 years was so prominent. Because the reality is they have a 2-year, 10-year, then they're leaving. So when speaking to different millennials of different demographics, the same point came across. Whereas we saw it as a negative connotation to be jumping from one job to another, they saw it as the expansion of their essential toolbox. So basically, as they moved from one job to another, they were expanding their repertoire of what they could do. So if they spend 2 years in a customer service phone center, now you have your customer service phone call center, typically sales associated with, then they would go do some marketing. And now they have a marketing insight and background. So they're taking, because with most employers, the first couple of years are when you disseminate the most information. Because the understanding is that you're relatively new. You may not have any experience in the field. Most jobs are entry level, but they're also the first available job to receive as much information as possible in regards to that job itself. But in that 2 years, just as they're on the outside, they're receiving all this information. It's all coming in, they're expanding. And when they get to that 2-year point, right when they're in that transition where they've apexed of all the available information that's available, being it training or some kind of designation or some kind of reimbursement from the employer, giving them an incentive to learn things, they get to this point when they're like, well, is there any other benefit for me staying and just, you know, continue doing the same thing? Or do I go to the next opportunity, which possibly is going to be of bigger financial interest and lead to something else that I want to do that I found that I want to do here? I don't want to do this. This might give me more. I'll have another 2 years of dissemination of information, just broadening my worth. So now if I put down my resume, it's a bunch of one-liners: marketing, sales, customer service, retail, risk management, this broader range. What employer would not want someone with such a diversified background? So as where we saw the connotation being negative, and you should be steadfast in going to one company, starting the mailroom, work all your way up. Again, millennials have flipped it on its head, saying, now I'm taking information from all these different avenues, making me just as making my use just as good as the internet itself. Because think about it, the internet gives us all the information that we want. Wouldn't we want to employ with this same diversity? Wouldn't we want to employ this has that same broad spectrum of ability? They might not be an expert in any particular field, but initially, if they have information from every single aspect, it's more insight they can bring in with them. Eventually, like myself, and I'm sure yourself, you found something that you'd want to specialize in. There's a niche that you want to pursue. So any information moving forward, it's all about that niche. For myself, it's millennial succession and retention. And everything that comes across, if it's any kind of informatic, I'm on it. Where, you know, previously, again, prior generations, there was one path, one way to get there, A to Z. It's no longer the case.
That's perfect. That's exactly why I wanted to ask that question. And I really hope that the brief time that, you know, we've been able to spend together here, I hope that shifts people to the work you've done and the work you're continuing to do, because we're at a point now where we can't generalize. We need to really get into, you know, data-driven ideas, things that are backed by professionals like you, people that have studied this. And that really was what hit me. You know, your energy was everything. And I thank you for bringing that to that Insurance Nerds Day, because it connected with that audience. And, you know, I'm going to continue to read up. I'm going to continue to probably send you questions here. But if folks want to get in touch with you, right, something that we talked about today spark some interest, what's the easiest way to get in touch with you to kind of continue some of the conversations that we started here today?
So that's a great question. So for me, I'm utilizing technology. So LinkedIn is my prominent dominant site where I post most of my millennial articles. InsuranceNerds.com. You can catch my daily vlogs that apply specifically to the insurance industry if that's an avenue that you want to look at. Up and coming, my Instagram account, if you're just looking for 3-second snips of what's going on in the millennial world, it's a great place to go. I mean, the great leaving point is anywhere you see hashtag Laissez Not Lazy, you'll find me there.
Let's close it out. Laissez Not Lazy. What are
Sure.
we talking about?
Laissez Not Lazy was disseminated from my doctoral study, which basically found the best method of leadership for millennials is laissez-faire leadership. So as most will remember from your social studies class, laissez-faire, dealing with economic environments, was essentially saying, government, take a hike. Let the market, supply and demand, do what it needs to do to regulate itself. Well, essentially that's what's going on with millennials. As I said in the talk, leadership needs to be like water. They need to be these conductors of this energy that we talked about being that energy the millennials are conducting. But it's an anthem in two parts. Laissez Not Lazy is saying, well, from a millennial's perspective, I'm not lazy. Get out of my way. From a leadership's perspective, laissez leadership, when you talk about it in most research, is connotated as being a negative leadership style because most leadership books emphasize transformational, transactional. There's that direct contact with the employee to hopefully solicit a return commitment. Well, with millennials, it's the opposite. It's that passive leadership, being laissez-faire leadership, that garnishes the most job embeddedness, the most commitment by them. Now, it's not to say, be lazy. Don't just say, you guys come in, do whatever the heck you want. It is what it is. It's not that. Laissez-faire leadership is giving them the resources that they need, but not being that helicopter or hovering parent. Not coddling them, let them experience the trials and tribulations that we all went through to become the people that we want to be eventually, but be a relative source to give that guidance when it's needed.
So that's the piece of it that brings it all together. And I think I have a lot more to learn, obviously, from you, and I'm going to continue to follow the work you're doing. But this was exactly what I had hoped for. I wanted to take a step back and say, let's dig into the science here. Just generations of people recognizing that shared mission and working together is the way to get there. You're really leading that. You're one of the you're one of the more dead-on voices I've heard on this topic. So I can't tell you again how much I appreciate you coming unquoted today.
Well, thanks, Brad. I appreciate you, your audience, and hit me up. I'm here, happy to answer any questions.